Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the True North Report, news every Canadian needs to know. Now, today I just want to focus on one topic, and that is the current banking system. Most people are probably aware of the term debt slavery. Now, debt slavery is the process in which people are kept under control by the monetary system. This is done by people have bills and debts that they need to pay off. And they do this by controlling the money, so that way people can't really get ahead in life. This is done through different methods, such as the current fiat currency system, from hyperinflation and depression of the dollar. But the point is that it's meant to control you, keep you working constantly, so that way you can't really get ahead. You maybe just are able to pay off your bills, pay off your debts, and maybe have a little bit of money, but more often than not, you're fighting to keep your head above water. Most people, aside from maybe the richest in the world, suffer from some form of debt slavery. The average citizen probably has trouble making ends meet, more often than not, I would say. Even the middle class suffers from debt slavery. In doing so as well, by keeping you working constantly, longer hours, what ends up happening is it's harder to stay on top of everything that's going on in our world, which makes it easier for the mega corporations and the true people who are ruling our world, allows them to get away with just about whatever they want. And it's less likely for people to rock the boat simply because they're not really going to question or challenge a system that they can barely stay ahead of, but then they're relying on a lot of the social programs that the government institutes in order to make ends meet. This can be the welfare system or other form of monetary compensation that the government gives. This could be the child benefit program and many others. Now, the system is built up this way in order to control you. Literally, debt slavery. Now, first, when we sort of talk about the system, we got to talk about fiat currency. And fiat currency is the currency that we use today, which is money that is not tied to anything. It doesn't really have any intrinsic value. At one point, every single currency around the world did have intrinsic value, and it's been tied to different things, but for a long time, it was usually gold. Silver was also used, and other sort of precious metals, but gold was really the big one. The money that we use these days isn't tied to anything. Most of the time, we're just comparing it against the U.S. dollar, but also the petrodollar also is used as well. But because we don't have a system a money system that is tied to anything, it allows for hyperinflation and depreciation of the dollar. This can be seen in many different examples around the world. Probably the most modern one has been Venezuela. If you've been paying attention to Venezuela recently, then you know that they've gone through such hyperinflation that their dollar is worthless. You can find pictures of their money just scattered amongst the streets. People can throw away thousands of dollars and really not be throwing away much money. This can also be seen in some pictures from Venezuela where people are walking in to pay for their groceries with wheelbarrows full of cash because that's how much hyperinflation has hit them. It has just made it that their dollar is worthless. This also happened in Zimbabwe. You can go online and literally find a picture of a $100 trillion Zimbabwe bill. Now, despite the fact that this is $100 trillion in Zimbabwe currency, it only equals to about 40 cents US, and that was back in 2015. I believe that Zimbabwe has since moved on to a different form of currency simply because what they were doing was unsustainable. Now, one way that you have your money gets watered down is through massively printing off new bills. It's like anything. The more there is in the world, the less value it holds. The most important, the most expensive things in this world usually are rare, and for that reason is because there's so few, people are willing to pay high amounts of money in order to obtain it. And when you have a large quantity of something, you sell it at a low rate. This is exactly what ends up happening when you print off a bunch of money. Now, The fiat currency, again, it used to be that our currency was tied to gold. And the advantage of this is that it didn't really allow for much fluctuation in the value of your dollar. There would always be some, of course, there always is. Gold still fluctuates on the market today. But when it was tied to the gold standard, there's only so much gold in the world, and you only had so much gold in your reserves, which meant you could only print off a certain amount of money. This was there's always disadvantages with the gold standard, but I think it had more positives than it did negatives. This changed. In many countries, it happened around World War I, and it actually kind of made sense at the time because when World War I hit, they were facing a war that they never had seen before, which required a lot of money and a lot of resources thrown into it, and there wasn't enough gold in order for them to actually pay for everything, pay for all the weapons, pay for all the food for their soldiers, and so on, pay the soldiers themselves. So a lot of countries, the British did this, and so did the Canadians. They went off the gold standard for fiat currency, so that way they could print more and put more out in circulation and pay for what they needed. Pay for the shells, pay for the bullets, pay for the rifles, pay for the tanks and all other forms of weapons. Now, that ended up happening, and then about 10 years or so after the war, both our countries ended up going back on the gold standard, but it didn't last for long. It lasted until about the Great Depression. And then the Bank of England officially went off the gold standard by about 1931 to 33. I can't remember the exact date, but about that time, Canada pretty much was about the same time. The US abandoned the gold standard in 1933, and by 1934, there was the Gold Reserve Act, which actually made it illegal for, unless you had a license, for any citizen to hold any private stashes of gold. They actually had to turn in their gold, whatever it happened to be, whether they held gold bars, whether this was gold necklaces or bracelets, they had to turn this in. And pretty much ever since, just about every single country has gone on to a fiat currency. Now, the banking system is set up as a con. The whole thing is just waiting to fall down. And it nearly has in the past. We can look back what happened in 2008. The system nearly completely collapsed, but it received bailout money from the governments, from the US governments, and even the Canadian government, even though people don't talk about that and say our banks didn't need to be bailed out. Prime Minister Harper did bail out the banks back in 2009 or 2010. So the system is almost collapsed, and it's almost like it's built in order to collapse. It is built like a Ponzi scheme, like a pyramid scheme. We can take a look at this perspective. There are different types of banks out there. At the bottom of the totem pole is the population. We're the ones who receive the money from our paychecks, we spend the money, and then we deposit it into our accounts. And we deposit it in a commercial bank. Now, there are many different types of banks out there. There are some banks that just deal with businesses, give out loans to businesses. But the commercial bank kind of covers all areas when it comes to banking for the most part. That this is where the average citizen receives their bank account, their checks, their credit cards. They also give loans out to businesses, so on and so forth. The banks themselves receive their money from a central bank. And in Canada, that is the Bank of Canada. In the US, that is the Federal Reserve. What ends up happening is that the commercial banks, when they need more money, they give a treasury note, if we're looking at from the US perspective, but it works the same way in Canada, just different names more or less. But they give what's called a treasury note to the central bank, so the Federal Reserve. They do this, says, I need X amount of money. Let's say it's $1 billion that they need. And pretty much these treasury notes are IOUs. So the Federal Reserve ends up printing out the money that they need and they hand it to them. Now, there are a series of banks that are even higher than the central bank of a country, and those are the international banks. This includes the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlement, and international organizations, monetary organizations such as the International Monetary Fund. So these are international banks. So this is sort of how it works. And you can kind of see how it leads up to a pyramid scheme. You've got a huge number of the population at the bottom. You've got a smaller amount of commercial banks, and these can be any sort of local bank all the way up to the big five banks here in Canada, which is CIBC, RBC, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and Toronto Dominion Bank, also known as TD. And then moving your way up, you have, in the country itself, it is the central bank, but if you're taking into account across the world, you have a bunch of central banks inside a country. And then at the very top of the pyramid, you just have a very few select international banks and international monetary organizations. And when you look at how the money works, you could see why this is ready to collapse. See, in a Ponzi scheme, somebody starts off at the top and brings in a few people, and then those few people who pay into the Ponzi scheme are expecting their money back. Now, in order to pay these people back, the first person needs to bring in, the person at the top of the pyramid needs to bring in more people who are willing to pay into it. And then the money gets redistributed amongst the first investors. And this has to continue and continue and continue until eventually it's too big and it will collapse. Now, Ponzi schemes are illegal, but not our current banking system. And why is it set up to fail has to do with interest rate. See, the way it works is that, you probably know this, is when you take out a loan, you owe interest on the loan. If you don't pay it all back in the allotted amount of time, they tack on a little bit extra money that you have to pay them because you haven't paid them back in the allotted time. So that's the way that banks make money. But now think about it from this perspective. When the bank issued out its very first dollar and it loaned it to somebody, that money had interest on it. So that's the very first dollar in circulation. But now the bank is expecting back that dollar plus interest. But there's no extra money in circulation in order to pay that back off. So that means that you have more debt than you do have money in circulation. Meaning you can never actually get out of debt. And that's as a nation. You can never really get out of debt for that very reason. It's actually quite ingenious if you think about it, but the system can never actually stand. And the reason it can never actually stand is because sooner or later, your debts are going to get called in. And this is why we have a debt ceiling, which means that when you reach a certain point, you're not supposed to be loaned out any extra money. But everybody knows that sooner or later, you're going to owe them money. I'm saving this for later, what you're seeing on your screen. We'll get into that in just a minute. So that is why the system is built to fail. That is why the banking system is built to fail. But just like a Ponzi scheme, the person at the top, in a Ponzi scheme, a lot of times when it fails, maybe they'll face legal repercussions, but they're the ones that get away with all the money, while the people at the bottom of the Ponzi scheme lose their money. So the banks get away, and we're the ones that lose the money, left there to pick up the pieces. This is exactly what happened in 2008. When the banks were giving out all these predatory loans, and the whole thing came crashing down. The banks needed a bailout, which is what they did. Many of these banks received bailouts from their governments. And many of these executives who ran these banks received bonuses with that bailout money. Hundreds of billions of dollars were given to these banks and those executives who were the reason that the crash ended up coming. The 2008 financial crash happened, received bailouts. And this includes ING, Goldman Sachs, and a few others. Those are probably the biggest names that you'll recognize. In fact, AIG, 73 of its top executives received seven-figure bonuses from this, even though they were the ones responsible for these predatory loans that ended up causing a bunch of people to lose their houses and cause one of the worst financial crashes since the Great Depression. So we already can see that if history is to repeat itself on the next huge financial crash, then the banks are going to get away with it, and the average citizen is the one who's going to pay. They're the ones who are going to lose their home, lose their money. But we also can't talk about the system without talking about fractional reserve banking. Now, fractional reserve banking is literally the process of making money out of thin air. Now, how does this work? See, the way that fractional reserve banking operates is that the banks only have to hold a certain amount of the money that is deposited into their system in reserve. And these are for people like when you walk into your bank and say, I want to take out $100. They need to have some money left there, so that way they can give it to you. This can range from 90% down to 10%. In some areas, they can even have lower than 10%, which means that if they have, just for the sake, make it easy on us for this example, if they have $100 in their bank, and they say that they have, their fractional reserve banking says that they only have to hold 10%. That means that they can lend out $90. And that is officially creating money out of thin air. So the way this works, right? So we have fractional reserve banking. If they only have fractional reserve banking of 10%, I think I may have messed up when I was explaining it. When they have fractional reserve banking of 10%, they have to hold 10% of the money that they have, and then they can loan out the other 90. Now, the way that it creates money out of thin air is because, let's say, we'll take our example of $100. So the bank holds back $10, and they loan out $90 to somebody. Now that $90 must be returned to the bank plus interest. So if they have an interest of 10%, that $90 has to be returned plus another $9. So out of that $100 that was the bank originally owned, they've now have $109. And that's on a small scale. We can take this up to a much bigger scale. And you can see why this would be a problem. You take that up, and now we're talking billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars. Think about how much money that amounts to. And then this process can continue. It's not strictly that that's the way it works, but they can actually then lend out the money and create even more money from what was returned. And the way this works is because customer number one is loaned $90 from the $100. They spend that $90. They still owe the bank that $90 plus interest. But they spent their money on customer number two at his shop, and customer number two deposits that money in the bank. So now that bank only has to hold back 10% of what was put in, meaning they can now loan out $81. And this is what I wanted to show you. It can literally compound itself through various banks, and we can see it here. So the bank, we're starting at the top, bank one has all these banks have fractional reserve banking of 10%. So $100 is lent out. Customer number two spends that $90 customer number one spends that $90 at customer number two's grocery store, let's say. So now customer number two, who received that $90, deposits that $90 into bank number two, and the bank only has to hold back $9, meaning they can loan out $81 to customer number three. Customer number three goes out and spends that $81 on customer number four. Customer number four deposits it in bank number three. That bank number three only has to hold back $8.10 and can loan out $72.09. Do you see how this is working? We started out with $100, and it just keeps compounding. So when we come here at the bottom, that 10% reserve becomes $100. The deposit of $100 is where we started. It now has become $468.50. The loan money, which was started out as $90, has now become $368.50. So when we started with $100, my math offhand is not that great, but we are talking 900 and some odd dollars that were created by this $100. This is fractional reserve banking. But the money doesn't exist. The money is just a number in a computer. It's not a physical dollar that's in circulation. So we've just created, the banks, have just created almost $1,000 out of thin air. Or at least about 900 or so dollars out of thin air, roughly. But that money is nowhere in circulation. Do you see the con that our current banking system is? It doesn't add up. It will never add up. And because that money does not exist, it can never be truly paid back. This is why the whole banking system is a con. But the con goes bigger than that. See, Canada has a lot of debt. Right now, we roughly put it at about $1 trillion in debt. So we have $1 trillion in debt, but we also have interest on that debt. Now, the debt itself is not going to the Bank of Canada. In fact, this is exactly what the Bank of Canada was created for. It was so that way we had a public bank. It actually started out. As a private bank in 1934 when the Bank of Canada Act was passed, which created this centralized bank. But by 1938, it became a publicly owned bank. And that's different than the Federal Reserve, which is actually still a private bank. But anyway, so we have a bank that is meant to give out money to the Canadian government when it needs it, without interest. And for very obvious reasons, because if you add interest on money you don't have, then you have to pay back more than they're giving you, and you don't have the money in circulation to pay it back, which means you can never pay it back. You never can. And this worked for a while. In fact, if you kind of take a look through our debt over time, Canada actually had relatively low amount of debt. But all of that has changed over recent years. You look back and you even look at our debt come World War I. It's nothing in comparison of what we had today. Now, by World War II, the debt kind of became a little bit worse. Just a little bit. But it's nothing in comparison to what happened by 1974. And I have a graph here that I have saved that I would like to share with you, and we can see what ended up happening. But give me 1 second. I need to set something up in order for you to see. Hold on. There we go. We're setting her up. There we are. So here's this graph that I wanted to show you. Saved in some of my notes. So this is the federal government's net debt from Confederation 1867 all the way up to 2015 in billions of dollars. As you can see here at the bottom, we go along, and about right here is 1915, so we're already into World War I. The debt hasn't changed much. I'm sure if we went into it for a closer look, it would. Over here is 1943, so we can see how all the way to 1947 we did gain a little bit of debt. But you look over at 1975, and look how much that spiked. Look at the skyrocket that we had there. That more or less continued until 1995 when it dropped a little bit, all the way to 2007 when it spikes back up. Now, why has this ended up happening? Why did we have this debt that barely accumulated into anything for over 100 years suddenly become so terrible? To the point where we owe $1 trillion and we're constantly paying interest payments on that. The reason that this ended up happening was because Canada was sold out by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I'm sure this won't surprise most of you, but we ended up getting sold out by Pierre Elliott Trudeau because before, Canada would only borrow from the Bank of Canada with low to no interest rates, although even the low interest rates is part of a con, in my opinion, because this is the Bank of Canada, which should be loaning out government to the country for 0% interest. But then again, I suppose that doesn't really give the government a reason to pay back its debts. So we have Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who sold out Canada, and he did this by allowing Canada to begin borrowing from these international banks. These international banks are predatory banks. They don't just come in and say, hey, we're willing to offer you some assistance, but they come in when a country's at a really low point. Now, when it came to 1974, this was just after another financial crash that the world just went through, which was, at the time, I think it was the worst since the Great Depression, but it's not as bad as what happened in 2008. But in 1972, the economy ended up crashing, the world economy. So it was in 1974 when Pierre Elliott Trudeau gave permission for the Canadian government to begin borrowing from international banks. And the international banks are predatory banks that give you high interest rates. They'll lend you whatever money you need, but they're giving you high interest rates, which means that we have to pay back that money. And it's gotten so bad that 14% of our tax dollars are going to service our federal debt. Now, of the money that we owe of our entire debt, 70 to 75% of that is all interest related. So just the money that we've accumulated through interest rates. This is the con of the World Bank. Many countries are facing this. In fact, when we look at Venezuela, I look at what's happening and I can't help but feel that one thing about this is that it is is being manipulated by the World Bank, because by the World Bank and these international organizations, because back when Hugo Chavez was in power, he actually managed to pay off the debts that was owed to, I believe it was the International Monetary Fund. So the government of Venezuela was in debt to them, and he actually managed to pay it off, mostly through their oil, because Venezuela is one of the most, if not the most, oil-rich countries. So he paid it off, and then they weren't planning on taking any more debt. And then slowly and slowly, as time goes on, we're starting to see how they're reaching a breaking point, how they're suddenly becoming one of the richest countries in all of South America. Their currency is destroyed. Their currency is destroyed underneath Maduro, this dictator. And don't get me wrong, Hugo Chavez was a dictator too. But now the IMF is moving in. They've actually said that they are willing to lend a hand to Venezuela with everything that's going on. Now, Venezuela is going through a lot of hardships. Well, first and foremost, because of socialism. Socialism doesn't work. But second of all, because there's a lot of sanctions that they are facing these days through the US and others, which makes their situation even more difficult. Now, many of these international banks, in fact, I believe all of them, are owned by the banking dynasty families that you are familiar with. These are the Rothschilds, these are the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and many more like this. And I believe one of the reasons that they have put a focus on Venezuela is also because when this was going on, it was actually Maduro himself who was planning to try and start up a cryptocurrency that was tied to the petrodollar in order to get his people out of the situation that they're in. And I believe this is why the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers put their sights on Venezuela, because this would be a direct threat to what they wanted, and they want Venezuela to take their debts from them. This also something similar ended up happening in Ukraine at the outbreak of the Ukrainian Civil War. Is that in this case, it may have been the IMF, it may have been the World Bank, but they ended up moving in on Ukraine when the Civil War happened, saying, "We're willing to help you out." But these are loan sharks. Loan sharks come to you when you're in your worst time, their most financial problems, and they say, "Hey, we're here to help you." But then they break your legs when you're not paying back what you owe. This is exactly what the world banks are doing. It's their way of keeping us even more in debt slavery than we ever have been before. And just one way that you can see that this is what's going on is for how many of these, is just how many of our, the governors of the Bank of Canada have been involved with the Rothschilds and other big banks and other big banks and other banking dynasty families. But we can look over a few that we have, and this is just even the most recent. But we can also look back and even farther than that, and we can see it. So let's take a look here. What I have. So we can look into David Dodge, who was the governor from February 1st, 2001 to December 31st, 2008. Hold on. So we got David Dodge. Now, when we look into him, we can see that he at one point was a chairman of the board of directors of the C.D. Howe Institute. And Rothschild is also a member of the C.D. Howe Institute, one of the Rothschild members. But the Rothschilds work together. The funny thing is when we look at the members of the C.D. Howe Institute, too, it brings up some interesting names. The first one you can probably see there at the top is J.P. Morgan Securities Canada, Inc. So J.P. Morgan, another banking dynasty. But then if we look down closer to the bottom, Morneau Sobecco, our current financial minister, is Bill Morneau. And you probably are more familiar with Morneau Sheppel. But Morneau Sobecco was originally his company. And in fact, I believe this it was Morneau Sobecco was actually started up by his father, which Bill Morneau ended up taking over and later became Morneau Sheppel. But as you can see, they have a stake in the C.D. Howe Institute, which is also part of the reason you won't see Bill Morneau or Justin Trudeau speaking out about this situation. And just below him, we have N.M. Rothschilds and Sons Canada Limited. So that's just over here. So at the time, I guess, of Morneau Sobecco, when it got involved with the C.D. Howe Institute, it was Bill Morneau. It says after the David Dodge, I believe the guy's name was, David Dodge, after he retired from the Bank of Canada, he joined Bennett Jones LLP as a senior advisor. Bennett Jones LLP is an international recognized Canadian law firm. Irene Bridger graduated from Rockefeller University in New York. I believe Irene Bridger was one of the main people, maybe a CEO of Bennett Jones LLP. Former Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed, he was Premier of Alberta when Trudeau's Liberals looted the Alberta oil wealth, and this would be Trudeau Sr., Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Peter Lougheed is a Freemason, is reported to represent the Rockefeller money in Alberta. We also have the former Premier of BC, Christy Clark, who recently joined Bennett Clark. So, we can move on even from there. We have Mark Carney. He was appointed Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada in August 2003. He has a 13-year career with Goldman Sachs, which is Rothschild owned and operated, in its London, Tokyo, New York, and Toronto offices. We have Stephen S. Poloz, who served for seven years, starting in June 2013. He's a member of the board of directors of the Bank of International Settlement, one of these international banks, The Rothschilds are the hidden powers of the BIS. The men who founded the BIS were working for or with the House of Rothschild when they founded the bank. Let's see what else I have here. Stephen Poloz is the current chair of the BIS Audit Committee and former chair of the Consultative Council for the Americas. The Consultative Council for Americas was created by the Bank of International Settlement, which is an extension of the Rothschilds. There are many more that you can go back and check, and you can see how it's all connected back to the Morgans, to the Rothschilds, to the Rockefellers. And you can see how we're being manipulated from top down. There is not one politician that speaks out about our current banking system today. Now, at one point, Maxime Bernier was one of those politicians that used to speak out against the Bank of Canada. You can go back on his YouTube channel, go back all the way to 2009, and you can see him talking about it, where he's giving actual hard questions to the governor of the Bank of Canada. And he talks about our monetary system. But he has since stopped. And as I understand it, he has mentioned that ever since he broke off from the Conservative Party and started up the People's Party of Canada, the Bank of Canada is not high on his priority list. So there is not one politician speaking about the situation that we're in, the danger that we face. And I will leave you today with a quote by William Lyon Mackenzie King, the former Prime Minister of Canada in 1935. He said, quote, "Once a nation parts with the control of its currency and credit, it matters not who makes the nation's laws. Usury, once in control, will wreck any nation." End quote. And that is a partial quote that has been attributed to one of the Rothschilds as well, where he says, "Give me control over the nation's wealth, and I care not who makes its laws." But this quote itself came from William Lyon Mackenzie King. And I also want to leave you with a quote by economist Ellen Brown. Quote, "By 2012, the government had paid $1 trillion Canadian in interest on its federal debt, twice its national debt. Interest on the debt is now the government's single largest budget expenditure, larger than healthcare, senior entitlement, or national defense." End quote. So you can see how every single one of us have been enslaved through debt slavery. Thank you all for joining me here today on the True North Report. I'll be back soon with more news that you need to know.